let's start to record it right now. And I think that because we caught it early on, it should be, hopefully enough for you to pick up from here with the recording. Sorry, everybody. I don't know what's going on. It's been a busy day. But thank you for reminding me. And if there's anything else that comes up, just let me know and I'll address it. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. Let me just take a look at the chat really quickly. There's quite a few chats here. You guys are so awesome. Thank you for being so cool. Yeah, Tupac. This is where it begins to get more interesting. Now, these rebellions that began to appear and really problematized central control were led often by indigenous leaders. And the most famous of those indigenous leaders was undoubtedly Tupac Amaru, who led a revolt between 1780 and 83 that really began to put in perspective the fierce conflict between the various social groups in Latin America. Now, the name rings a bell because, of course, we know the late rapper Tupac, who was an inspiration to us all, and who himself was inspired by Tupac Amaru in the heroic, bold, rebellious nature of Amaru during this time. Now, what exactly did Amaru do, and why was he an inspiration to Tupac? Well, he was an inspiration because he led widespread attacks on Spanish property and persons. And not only that, but he harnessed Criollo opposition to the Bourbon reforms to lead these attacks. And he was able to spearhead an opposition that became quite fierce. Now, Amaru was eventually captured and tortured to death, but his revolt had an incredible impact. It helped to spur and ignite a fierce sort of rebellious opposition to the Bourbon reforms and to the crown and to the continuation of central control from Spain. So Tupac was an inspiration, and he himself was an important figure despite his eventual torture and capture and death. Tupac was important for so many reasons, but primarily because of the way in which he organized Criollo opposition. Now, the Criollos were themselves quite complicated, and the story is not the way we sometimes expect it to play out. The truth is that the Criollos did not join with the indigenous. And though the indigenous largely opposed the crown, Tupac's efforts were not as successful as he could have hoped. The Criollos themselves opposed joining with the indigenous because they feared the possibility of class and race wars in which they could lose. Now, this was a time when the Spanish were putting more power in the hands of military leaders to ensure that there were no more rebellions. And so the Criollos were very, very paranoid about the possibility of alliances between actors, including the indigenous, who could make it difficult for the Criollos to bring about the outcome that they would want. They largely feared the possibility of being defeated by any alliance between the indigenous and some other group. But they also, of course, wanted to protect their economic holdings and their wealth and their power against both the Peninsulares and the Indians. And so even though the Indians in some sense represented a potential ally, they were very fearful of them because of the issue of race and class, and because of the possibility of eventually losing their wealth and their power to Indians or to Peninsulares. And this set of divisions between these various actors is incredibly important because as we go along, what you'll see is that these divisions tend to reproduce themselves throughout Latin American history. And these differences and these disparities, if you will, would become very consequential, particularly during the post-independence period when state development would become an objective, but would become quite elusive because of those divisions and that fragmentation. And so the independence struggle itself contained a lot of the divisions that would eventually arise in the post-independence period. And those actors included, as always, the Criollos, the Peninsulares, the Crown, the Church, and the Indians. But of course, we have other groups as well. We've got mixed race groups. The point is that Latin America is an absolute melting pot of diversity and different groups and all sorts of different interests and different backgrounds. And this makes it hard from the start to organize the opposition. And it makes the Criollos skeptical of the indigenous in particular. Now, this independence struggle that's brewing in the late 1700s, it it gets a moment of opportunity in the form of Napoleon's conquest of Spain, which took place in 1808. Now, this was a moment that saw the removal of King Ferdinand and the installation of Joseph Bonaparte as king. Now, this was important because it created what we might refer to as a, a critical juncture or a moment of opportunity, a moment when the normal constraints on action might be lifted, and when actors who seek to reformulate the system can actually take advantage of the opportunity to act. And the Spaniards in Spain responded to this by forming a provisional government in defiance, and they called that the Supreme Junta. And they called for a new constitution limiting powers of the monarch, a very liberal idea inspired by the American and the French revolutions. What's happening in Spain is interesting and important because it creates an opportunity in Latin America. And this formation of this Supreme Junta helps to create a cleavage or a division between those Spaniards in Spain and those Criollos in Latin America, who we just discussed are seeking the power and influence and independence for themselves. The Criollos in Latin America, they use the opportunity to rally for the displaced king, but they also call for ideas that are embodied in the French Revolution and the Spanish revolts. They call for a new constitution. They call for an order that's free from the tyranny of kings. They want the kind of independence that they'd already seen won in the present day United States or the former British colonies, where, as we know, a fierce struggle ensued that eventually gave way to the Declaration of Independence and the independence of the United States. The Criollos in Latin America are trying to do the same thing, and they're trying to use this opportunity, this moment in Spain, this kind of unsettling of normal circumstances, to force through in the creation of a new political order and to free themselves from Spain. Now, these Criollos, as a reminder, they're acting alone. They're not working with Indians. They're not working with Peninsulares. In fact, they're largely working by themselves. Now, in Latin America, juntas form. These are basically small groups of leaders who exchange power or share power over some territory or some political unit that pre-exists. And these juntas defy the French crown, and they rule in the name of King Ferdinand. But really, they're using this for the independence struggle. As I pointed out, they're using this moment to try to sort of tear things apart and rebuild and to free themselves and to declare independence. And ruling in the name of King Ferdinand and calling for the reinstallation of Ferdinand is a way to drive a wedge between themselves and the Spaniards in Spain. This is a moment when the Criollos are attempting to lead a revolt to its conclusion and to separate themselves, but they're not doing it with the Indians, and the Indians themselves are not the leaders of the revolt. The Indians themselves are largely fragmented at this time. The Criollos are better organized because there are fewer sort of group differences between them compared to Indians and indigenous who were ancient civilizations and had very well established differences. These Criollos, we must understand, were not working with Indians. As important as Tupac Amaru was, he in fact didn't represent collective action or coordination on the part of large indigenous groups. Now, along with this story, you must understand the following. Simón Bolívar and San Martín, the liberators, as many of you may already know, they did not come from poor families. They were not, these kind of working class, contemporary language. They weren't working class boys. They came from rich families and they came from privilege. And so they actually were in a position to resist Spanish rule precisely because of their privilege. Now, what they ultimately did would be no less important and no less consequential, but you must understand that San Martín and Simón Bolívar were not exactly as inspirational in the way that we might think if we think of them as coming from a hard upbringing. In fact, they came from riches and from wealth. Keeping that in mind, let's move forward and talk more about these actors and the conflicts that play out and how they eventually give way to independence. I'm going to check the chat really, really quickly. Thank you, Diego. Diego says, fun fact, Simón Bolivar's full name is Simón José Antonio de las Santísima Trinidad Bolivar y Palacios Ponte Andrade y Blanco. I didn't know that. Wow, that's incredible. That's quite a name. This is him right here, by the way. So let's move forward to a moment, a breaking point, a moment when things truly would give way and a surge of independence movements and uprisings would actually translate to this independence. So by 1814, Napoleon, who had been installed, had been defeated and Ferdinand had been restored. Now, Ferdinand discarded the new constitution, that liberal constitution that we talked about that emerged in Spain, and he rules with absolute authority and an iron fist, crushing opposition, seeking to. Eventually, many conservative criollos in Latin America give up the fight, but not Bolivar and San Martin. They remained devoted to the cause, and they remained devoted enough that independence struggles did continue. The weakness of the Spanish crown, combined with the persistence of San Martin and Bolivar and the criollos, would lead to the last stand for the Spanish, and that was the Battle of Ayacucho on December 9th, 1824. This was the end for the crown and the beginning for Latin America as we know it. This was the moment when independence was won. This was the moment when the struggle gave way and the floodgates opened. And in subsequent years, Spain would withdraw, and Latin America would begin to develop in the ways that we're more familiar with today as independent republics. But the process of becoming those republics and consolidating territories and states would be a grueling and agonizing process that we'll discuss in detail as well. But for now, 1824 is the moment when the magic happens. This is the last stand in the beginning of Latin America as we know it. This right here is the constitution that was discarded by Ferdinand. This liberal constitution was incredibly contemporary for its time because it was based on, remember, those French and American ideals that had been embodied in their own constitutions and in their own independence struggles. This is a moment when Latin America has great opportunity, but also great peril, as we'll see, because of the condition that Spain left those future republics in. Now, before we continue and before we open up the floodgates further and get into the post-colonial period and the nature of state development in a place that has just been decolonized, we're going to have a group discussion. Well, technically it'll be small group discussions. What I'm going to do is set up small breakout rooms of, I think, 4 students apiece. And I'd like you all to discuss the following with your groups. The question is, what was the meaning of independence in Latin America? Based on your understanding of the reading and what you're bringing to the class, I want you to talk about the independence of Latin America and what it meant and what it means. Was it a victory for progressive ideals? Did it mean liberation for indigenous poor, Black slaves, non-white peoples? Who was this independence for? Independence for whom and by whom? I want you to discuss this with your other members of your assigned group. And then eventually I hope that your group will share your thoughts with the class, either using the chat or even the mic. But I'm gonna go ahead and create those breakout rooms right now. Zoom will assign you to those automatically. And you'll have a chance to talk with your group members for 5 or 10 minutes and discuss this question. And I want you to think about the actors and the groups that we already know: the indigenous, the criollos, the peninsulares, the Spanish crown, mixed race, Blacks, slaves, anyone and everyone. I want you to think about what independence meant for Latin America and for these different groups and what it meant just in general. So I'm going to go ahead and create those rooms and then work together. And if you've got any question for me, you certainly can contact me through the chat privately. You can also use the mic if you want. But I will give you the space to discuss this, and then we'll come back together. And I look forward to hearing some of the input and incorporating it as we go along. So I'm going to go ahead and do this right now. I've got to actually stop the share. Let's see, 52 participants into. All right, everyone. So I'm going to create 13 rooms for all 52 of us, and there will be 4 participants per room, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type the question in the chat, okay? So you can refer to that if you need to, and you can refer back to that. But I'm now creating the rooms. All of you have been invited to join a room, so please do so. And I am putting the question in the chat, okay? We will reconvene in about 5 or 10 minutes, and I look forward to getting back together, okay? So please do this and engage with your classmates and think about the issues involved. As you discuss this with your group members, do feel encouraged to share your insights or your conclusions in the chat when you're ready. That can give us a sense of where we are as a class and if we can begin to get back together again. We've been at it for about 4 or 5 minutes, but we'll take 4 or 5 more minutes. And as always, if you have questions or if you'd even like me to join you for a moment, I would be happy to. We do have a large number of groups, so I don't know if it's possible for me to join all of them, but I would make every effort if you all decided that you'd like me to stop by. All right, everyone, I think we've got about 2 or 3 more minutes before I'd like to close the rooms. And so if you want to share, and if please do share, someone from your group, maybe share the conclusions of your group and what you decided on, what your sense of this is. I look forward to hearing from the different groups and kind of incorporating the input. So we haven't heard from anyone yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the rooms. And so if you could designate maybe someone from the group, or if someone is okay taking the lead, I'll close the groups in about a minute or two, and then hopefully that individual can share what you decided on as a group. But I do think that we should reflect on this and respond and engage with each other as broadly as we can after being in our breakout rooms. So in about a minute, I'll go ahead and close the rooms, okay? So as we reconvene, I'd like to restate the question, what was the meaning of independence in Latin America? Independence for whom? Was this a victory for progressive ideals? Did it mean liberation for the poor, indigenous, black slaves, non-white people? Who did independence really benefit?
Independence only benefited the Criollos because they were the one fighting for it and they really didn't want to give up any of their power.
I see. So the Criollos viewed some of the other groups as in conflict with them, or maybe like they had different interests.
Yeah, one of the goals of the Creoles' independence war was to maintain the status quo as much as they could, just move themselves to the top instead of the Peninsulari. So there was no outpouring of progressive ideals, no liberation for anyone in the other groups that weren't the Creoles, because I think, at least in Peru, the Tupac Amaru rebellion scared a lot of the Creole people away from aligning with the Indians.
Absolutely. So yet again, we see this diversity playing out in real time and creating conflicts and tensions, conflicting interests between groups. But above all, we see the Criollos trying to retain their power and their wealth, and doing so in a way that would be disadvantageous to Indians and slaves, non-white people. And so independence didn't necessarily mean independence for all. In fact, it meant independence for maybe a narrow slice of Latin American society. And again, this had to do with interests and the vested interests that the different groups had, and primarily the Criollos. And so we've heard from John and also Ishan. We've also got some input in the chat that I'm going to take a look at as well. Aditya says, Aditya, Sarah, and Rosa, I think one of the biggest reasons is ownership. Similar to the US, the people could live under their conquerors, but it's more about having that independence and right to your own property. Of course, that isn't the only reason, though, just one of them. Liberation of the poor and black slaves were all drivers of the idea of independence. Aditya, Sarah, and Rosa, we certainly do see a role in some sense for the indigenous and for groups that were oppressed under Spanish control. But it may also be the case that the Criollos found themselves in opposition to some of those groups as well. Certainly, Tupac Amaru is an example of an indigenous leader who was involved in this struggle. But remember that Tupac Amaru wasn't that successful in coordinating the opposition of the Indians because the Criollos didn't work very much or at all with the Indians. They feared a race war. But the larger struggle did, in fact, emphasize goals of liberation. And so, in that sense, it is true that independence moved Latin American societies closer to a more just system. That's indisputable, especially considering how repressive Spanish colonial rule truly was. And so, it's a complicated situation, but it's certainly one that is amenable to different ideas and different perspectives. Leonardo says, in our group, we all felt as if the Criollos wanted to cut the middleman out and establish order that best suited them. It seems as if the natives were stuck between a rock and a hard place because they were never truly free from rule, but they were no longer in rule of Spain and the crown. Good, Leonardo. Group 7, that's true. That's a nuanced perspective, right? It's true that the Spanish crown's withdrawal meant that there were more possibilities for liberation in Latin America, even if the Criollos largely engineered independence to serve their own interests. We can see how Spanish withdrawal may have created the possibility of freedom for more groups, even if they didn't own land. And we will see that in subsequent centuries, there would be progress of a kind, but sometimes it would be halting and stuttering. This is very good. Is there anyone else who would like to take the floor for a moment and comment and share what their group discussed? Everything so far has been nuanced and sophisticated, and I think largely on point with some small rejoinders. Is there anyone who would like to share further what they discussed with their group?
Sorry, I just wanted to like elaborate a little more on the second question of what my group had said.
Yeah.
So we thought that it wasn't a progressive ideals because typically progressive ideals are meant to like accommodate for the ordinary people, which I would say is like the natives or like the indigenous people from there. And it kind of seemed as if they were just kind of like even more marginalized throughout this. Like they didn't really have a saying, and it was just kind of like something new was thrown at them. Like now it wasn't the crown, now it was like a new like set of rules, but they still weren't like the center of focus. They still didn't get like really any attention through this, if that makes sense.
Totally. I really like how you put that, Clarissa. It's like they kind of replaced Spanish colonial rule with like the rule of Criollo interests or a narrow set of interests that may have already existed in Latin America, but they didn't accommodate like the indigenous or black slaves or non-white people really at all.
Yeah, that's what we thought as well.
Yeah, I think that's on point. Are there any other groups who would like to comment before we move on? Take a look at the chat here. Jose says, in our group, we discussed how some nations had very progressive ideals, such as Honduras. Samantha explained to us how there was no slavery in this country and how land and rights were provided to indigenous groups. So I have to admit that I don't know as much about the specific experience of Honduras, but it sounds like Samantha knows the case really well. And I think we would love to hear from Samantha, but of course, no pressure. But that's knowledge that I don't have necessarily. And so I think we would all benefit from learning a little bit more about that. There certainly probably were some variations in the region that were important and that we should pay attention to, and we should consider, important to study in their own right.
So I'm driving.
No problem.
So it might sound a little bad. As far as I understood, during slavery, there are a lot of Black people in Honduras, but it's because they're Garifunas who were invited after they escaped slavery in, I think somewhere in the Caribbean. I think most of them came from Jamaica, but I can't like be 100% sure from that. And the Honduras invited them to come over with full citizenship and have even granted them land as if they were indigenous people. And they're still there. They're called their land is usually like tela. They had it's their land. It's sacred and it's generational. You know, so that's as far as I understood. I also know that they were granted full access, like if they were actually born in it, because Honduras had understood that they had gone through a lot. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha, for sharing. And we heard you just fine, and I'm so glad that you could join us on the phone. However we tune in is great. We're all here together. This is a good discussion. I'm going to check the chat and see. John points out cracking up a little, but I think we got the gist of it. We got the gist of it for sure. And that's something I didn't know about Honduras. So I think I definitely learned something. This discussion we're having is so important because what we're highlighting is that those various interests that existed were often in conflict with each other and didn't necessarily work hand in hand to produce independence in the way that we might think of it in a kind of idealized way. Independence for whom is really what we should be asking. And then moreover, we should be asking, how did this in turn affect the path that would be set in Latin American republics created through the independence movement itself? And so what we'll see during the period of state development will duplicate and sort of reproduce some of the dynamics that we saw play out in the independence struggles themselves. And so this is all very relevant. And I'm so happy that we're picking up on this and that we have a variety of different points here. Joel says that Group 4 discussed that the Enlightenment ideals of democracy drove the independence in Latin America. Without a doubt, those ideals were certainly part of the kind of rhetoric or the kind of campaign for independence. But I think that once we peel back some of the rhetoric, we begin to see that those Criollo interests were largely viewed as mutually or separate from the interests of Indians and blacks and mixed race people, and especially Peninsulares and the Spaniards themselves. So though those Enlightenment ideals may have motivated what ultimately produced independence, the groups themselves were often in tension, or at least the Criollos didn't imagine their interests as dovetailing with those of other groups in Latin America, and especially the Indians, because of their fear of a race war. So this tells us that interests in race and ethnicity were all important factors at this moment and would be formative as these Latin American republics began to evolve and develop through the post-independence period. So we've now arrived at the sort of conclusion of our discussion of the colonial period in Latin America. And before we move on and begin to discuss the post-independence period that weaves together those various interests and identities, the questions of race and ethnicity, we need to address a question that is relevant from our perspective. And that question is, what were the main differences between the extractive colonies in Latin America and the settler colonies in North America? Now, this is a question that helps us to put in perspective how the US is different from Latin America, despite some of the similarities that we see today. And in the first place, we have to understand the meaning of a settler colony in contrast to an extractive colony. A settler colony was different because it was one where Europeans would form neo-Europes. They would duplicate and reproduce the institutions and the arrangements and the relationships that existed in their home countries in Latin America, or excuse me, in the colonies themselves. So these included like Australia, present day, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. And these Europeans, they were fleeing feudalism, retrograde economic relationships that often left them in bondage, essentially, religious persecution, all kinds of forces that left no room for them in their old Europe. And at the same time, however, they valued free markets and individualism. They valued the institutions of representative government and private property, checks against government power. They depended on agriculture and small holdings in agriculture and farming. Their interests were fundamentally different than the interests that characterized Latin America. these interests and ideas and institutions worked together to produce what we call settler colonies, or places where Europeans would go and, like I said, duplicate or reproduce their institutions and their interests and their ideas from back home. This was very different than the mercantilist colonies, the extractive colonies, where the Europeans would go and they would use and appropriate the existing indigenous institutions specifically to channel wealth back to the colony, or the colonizer, that is, the crown, the home country. So mercantilist and settler colonies were fundamentally different. And the institutions, the political institutions in particular, help us to see how these were different. Kings appointed governors who had great power, but the kings also allowed the creation of assemblies elected by free property owning men, emphasis on free property owning men. And since land ownership was widespread, a large percentage of those white men could vote and participate. Of course, women and Indians and slaves were not included, and even those white men who did not own property were also excluded. And so it was a very narrow set of interests that were accommodated in these settler colonies. Nevertheless, these patterns were duplications of what largely existed in old Europe. And so, relatively speaking, for the day, these were different kinds of colonies, or they were more liberal colonies from the perspective of that time period. Now, the governors could veto, but the assemblymen demanded more rights. And in particular, in Britain, the Glorious Revolution of the late 1600s helped to kind of legitimate calls for rights and freedoms in the US colonies. And so while Latin American colonies were under the oppressive weight and grip of Spanish colonial mercantilist rule, places like Australia, the United States, Canada were enjoying institutions and ideas and interests that were much more supportive of what we would think of from that perspective as democracy and private property ownership, participation in politics, and so on and so forth. Now, the farms that these settlers settled on were different from the huge haciendas that existed in Latin America. And this was incredibly important for what would follow, because this meant that societies of many property owners, as opposed to a few, would begin to emerge. That meant that wealth was not in the hands of only a few, it was dispersed very widely. That meant that there was much wider participation in politics. That meant that political and economic order was much more widely kind of arrayed, so to speak. And in general, there was a greater decentralization of power in the US among the 13 colonies than ever existed in colonial Latin America. Again, because the Spanish crown was so hierarchical and oppressive in its control of colonial Latin America. Now, settlers in the United States also did not face empires like the Aztecs or the Mayans or the Incas. And so they could defend themselves against Native Americans, and they did so with relatively small militias. This was also important because it meant that those settlers, in the case of the United States in particular, but also Canada, and also Australia and New Zealand, it meant that those settlers could easily defeat any indigenous opposition to their settlement. And so what's sort of ironic and one of the ironies of history is that even in those settler colonies, but maybe even particularly in those settler colonies, Indians were essentially eliminated just the same, and more deliberately so in the case of the United States, where we know that settler colonization meant the destruction and the elimination of indigenous people, at least a large proportion of them, deliberately so. And so all of this then meant that there was no need for a huge standing army to defeat the enemies that would appear. This meant that whereas in Latin America, there was a need to consolidate and concentrate military power, in the United States and elsewhere, there was less of a need for any of that at all. And in fact, normally settlers could defend themselves relatively easily against bands of indigenous groups who would take up arms against them. Well, not usually arms, but whatever weapons they had at their disposal. The story of the elimination of the indigenous and the near elimination of the indigenous in the United States is a gruesome story. It doesn't fit with the narrative of a liberal settler colony by any stretch. And so it's not a simple story. It's one that we should remember for what it was. But even so, those settler colonies were different than those mercantilist extractive colonies. And the main difference, despite the obvious gruesome brutality, is that the US settler colonies had essentially a democratic framework. Latin American societies did not. The US had assemblies that were quasi-independent. Latin American institutions, by contrast, answered to the crown. After independence in the United States, present day, colonial assemblies became the state legislatures. Latin America had no legislative component to build on by comparison. And there's also an important difference with regard to church and organized religion. US settlers were not beholden to one church, but to many. And so that meant that there was a further decentralization of influence. In Latin America, the Catholic Church was hierarchical, all-encompassing, and total. It ruled fearlessly so in totally. And this meant that there was no tolerance for dissenting views, and that oftentimes religious power and influence was often as brutal as that of the crown itself, because of the absence of tolerance for the dissent that was more permissible in the United States. And so we can kind of capture these differences in a relatively simple way. I showed you this graphic. This is a graphic from Mahoney, a book called Post-Colonial Development in Latin America. And that's a book you might want to check out. But this difference between mercantilist and liberal, or between extractive and settler colonies, can be summarized pretty neatly along these different dimensions that we discussed. Liberal colonies promote private property and trade. They promote investment. There's wider participation in politics and economics. There's few restrictions on trade or ownership or participation. And in general, there's a more market-based as opposed to social stratification-based society. There's a capitalist elite, and there's not the same kind of slavery. Well, there obviously was an important role for slavery in both types of places. But the point that I want to make to you is that it was more essential to the mercantilist setup to kind of take and appropriate and use these existing patterns of social stratification for the purposes of forced labor. Now, I don't want to whitewash any of this. And we should be clear that colonialism is mainly destructive in these kinds of ways. But there are still some differences between these different types. And no, Aditya, US settlers did not have to convert to Christianity. There was no required religion. It was, again, more liberal in its approach, in that it was a choice, and there wasn't the same kind of hierarchical and total control of the church in, say, the Spanish colonies. And so this helps us then to think about these differences. And the last thing that I want to highlight before we continue is that in the United States and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, landowners were independent. They obtained their land independently. In Latin America, you could only get your land titles from the crown. And so even those criollos who owned land got their land through titles from the crown. That was an important difference because it meant that the state was actively involved in parceling out property and in constructing property relations. It was also the case that US settlers did not draw on and enslave Indian populations immediately. We know that obviously slavery became an important part of economic production in the South, but this wasn't what drew them necessarily. These small farms were toiled by settlers themselves. In Latin America, Indians were the primary source of labor. They were exploited by Spaniards who refused to work. Now, again, I'm not whitewashing the differences, but I need to highlight that there was actually a difference in terms of the extent to which certain groups were appropriated. And of course, obviously the difference is that slaves were brought to the United States. And in the case of Latin American colonies, the indigenous, who were the ancient pre-Columbian civilizations, they themselves were the ones who were enslaved. And so that's a key difference. Finally, there's also a difference of values. It was very clear what the US revolutionaries were fighting for: give me liberty or give me death, no taxation without representation, and so on. In Latin America, it was not clear at all what the criollos were fighting for. They were fighting against Spanish colonial rule, that's a certainty, but what they were fighting for was far less clear. And that meant then that there was far less of a direction, and the process of developing those post-colonial societies would be more aimless as compared to what took place in the settler colonies, if you will. But what the criollos were fighting for, without a doubt, we can see this quite easily, is the right to control their own property and to rule themselves, and importantly, to continue to subjugate Indians. Now, many disagreed with the subjugation of Indians. It wasn't as if this was entirely agreed upon, but this was an important part of the context, and it was an important difference in the sense that those indigenous were enslaved. So at the end, we can say what Simón Bolívar reluctantly concluded, which is that Spanish colonialism had left Latin America unprepared for democracy, and that the people would have to settle for a system most likely to succeed rather than the best political system. And as you all pointed out, the way in which the criollos took control and appropriated the independence process, the way in which they saw their interests as fundamentally at odds with the interests of Indians and mixed race peoples, those differences meant then that the withdrawal of the Spanish colonial power would leave Latin American countries unprepared for a democratic society. And it meant that authoritarian rule would most likely fill the void. This is a critical difference that helps to set the stage for the rest of the story of Latin America in the sort of pre-modern period, or the pre-contemporary period, if you will. And this brings us to the post-independence and state development period, which we focus on from 1824 to 1899. And as we move forward, we're going to continue to use the categories and the concepts that we've developed: ideas, institutions, inheritance, international, and so on, and interests. We'll use these to continue to discuss Latin America and the development of the state in Latin America. Now, post-colonial Latin America, as you know, and as we've already established, this is a place that is disorderly and is very heterogeneous and very, very diverse. All of this diversity and this difference meant that states didn't have nations. There was anarchy. There was no central power. You had all these different groups with fundamentally different interests, different kinds of economic and political relationships. And that meant then that the absence of a nation and the absence of a collective sort of solidarity, it meant that the Spanish withdrawal would not leave these places prepared to set up constitutional assemblies, or to draw up new rules, or to create constitutions or sets of laws. It meant that there wouldn't be the same basis for that collective action that there was in, say, the United States, or the present-day United States. In truth, what existed in Latin America at this time was a power vacuum. And this was a power vacuum which would take decades to fill. Those decades would prove to be vicious, brutal, agonizing decades. And the bloodshed and the conflict and the war and the turmoil would eventually give way to a more stable set of patterns, but it would take a long, long time. And this was because, as I've already established, there was no sense of collective identity. There was no agreement between different parties or groups to build something in common. The criollos from the very beginning had viewed themselves in opposition to the others, especially indigenous, but also mixed race and black slaves. They were concerned about race wars and race and ethnic conflict. Now, one of the big issues, of course, is that there was so much racial, ethnic, and economic homogeneity, or there was not, excuse me, heterogeneity, I mean to say, sorry. We've already discussed this, but it's important to highlight that the whites owned the land, the brown-skinned were largely the wage earners, the black-skinned were the slaves, Indians were in there as well, and then there were the mixed bloods in, of course, all sorts of combinations of all of the above. Plenty of built-in differences, no central authority to arbitrate and reach settlements. You had what we would refer to as a very fragmented set of societies, or emerging republics, as you will. This set of differences we still see today, and in fact, political fragmentation is, according to some, worse than ever before in Latin America. And later on in the course, we'll discuss the historical legacies of colonialism, and we'll put some of this in context. We'll discuss this further. I'm going to check the chat really quickly. For the midterm, the end of this month, will you be providing some type of study guide? More on that soon, Abraham, but yes, I will provide some sort of study guide. This is an image that helps to capture that diversity and that difference in post-colonial Latin America. You've got everyone. You've got the indigenous, who the criollos still subjugate. You've got the criollos and peninsulares who still are there, but who have less power compared to the criollos. You've got everyone above. You've got mixed race, blacks, brown-skinned. You've got all of the different groups involved in these social and economic and political relationships that are emerging in these new republics. But what you don't see is a kind of solidarity and kind of collectivity among them. You see difference in disparity, in gaps in between them. And these differences would prove to be insurmountable. But what was also insurmountable was wartime destruction related to the conflicts during the revolutionary period, the leveling of towns, the destruction of economies. This made it really, really difficult to create those nation states that were so hard to form in the presence of so many differences. It wasn't just ethnic and racial difference, it was also the condition of these places. But these people in these places had differences in concepts, what kind of a system to create, centralized, federalized, a monarchy, a democracy, a military state. There was no agreement. And without agreement on these fundamental issues, no central government could possibly emerge. These are really, really important debates. It's not a small issue whether or not the state is federal, unitary, a monarchy, a democracy, or a military regime. These are questions that get to the heart of politics and differences between the interest groups that exist in any modern state. But that state, that Latin American state, could not be formed as a nation state in the presence of all these differences and these differences in concepts, unless there was some process of filtering and some process of conflict that would give way to the eventual formation of a state, a unitary state, or a sort of state that is a clearly and coherent territorial and racial and political and ethnic unit. But in terms of who actually ruled, if there was anyone who ruled, you had powerful landowners who often hired private militias, who were certainly very powerful. But you also had Indians, and they fought to keep their communal lands. And Indians were important as well, and we should not view them as powerless. We should view them as power brokers in their own right. You had slaves and you had ex-slaves who also had their own interests and who would wage rebellions of their own. You had bandits, cattle ranchers, guerrillas. Yes, this was like the Old West, but the question was, who would be the marshal of Dodge? Who would actually surface as the ruler in this disorderly post-independence environment of destruction, indifference, and disparity? The question was an open question at this point in time. And of course, there were the Criollos. They certainly wanted to rule. We know that they were largely in charge of the independence movement. If there's anyone that we could identify as at the forefront of the independence movement, these white descendants of Spain, they fought for their rights and their freedoms, but not for those of others. They viewed freed slaves and Indians and mestizos as threats. As far as they were concerned, those were not good for their interests. They viewed them as potentially able to undercut the Criollos, and they deliberately tried to suppress them. Now, it happened to be the case that these Criollos were also large landowners. Indeed, this is how they became relatively powerful and influential in the first place. And they often inherited and they often confiscated Spanish property, or what was formerly Spanish property. And in the process, they discovered that they needed protection for their property rights against those who had nothing. And this is when military force becomes important in Latin America. The Criollos, identifying their interest in the protection of their private property against Indians, against slaves, and against anyone else who might threaten the continuity of their wealth and their power. So they turn to the creation of what we would refer to as private militias. They hire caudillos. These were military political leaders or strongmen to protect their private property. They would pay these caudillos in land and riches. They, in turn, would grow rich. The caudillos themselves would dole out jobs and land to their own followers. And in the process, these military strongmen who supported and defended the interests of the Criollos developed their own power bases. This is how military force becomes important in Latin America. This sort of intersection and relationship between economics and politics and the need for the defense of private property held by the Criollos, who had spearheaded the independence movement for the betterment of their own interests at the expense of the Indians and everyone else. And so it is true that many Criollos benefited from confiscating estates from Spanish, but not all of them did. And so it wasn't the case that all Criollos necessarily agreed. Even though the Criollos were the ones largely in charge of bringing about the caudillos, it turned out that many of the Criollos had conflicting interests. They often grew resentful, and they often viewed their interests as though similar in conflict and in tension with one another. And so as if there wasn't enough difference in diversity and disparity and disorder in Latin America already, Criollos enlisting caudillos increasingly found themselves at odds with one another and increasingly decided to begin taking up arms against each other. And this is when caudillismo becomes an important part of Latin American political development. Now, this is what's been defined as follows: rule by any kind of preeminent leader who derived authority more by an ability through force of character and patronage to command the loyalty of a band of armed followers than from adherence to the rule of law or constitution. This has been defined specifically in the Latin American context in this way. And these criollos, who viewing themselves in tension with one another and in conflict with one another, they used violence and the threat of violence through these caudillos in this brand of caudillismo to get what they wanted. And they commanded respect from their loyal followers through the use of violence. So in the first place, what filled the void was violence, and organized violence carried out by caudillos enlisted by criollos seeking to defend and preserve their wealth and their power. This is how military force becomes important in Latin America, stretching all the way back to the colonial period and then the post-colonial period in the defense of economic interests formed through Spanish colonial rule. You see then how history and the legacies of history become quite important. None of us can escape our past. None of us can escape that. It's irrefutable. And so in Latin America, as elsewhere, history does weigh on the present, and the post-colonial period from the very start contained the same kind of disorder and diversity and difference, but also tendency towards violence that characterized the independence struggles as well. And so we have a post-colonial Latin America with many militaries, not just one, many militaries, waging battles on behalf of powerful landowners or for themselves, and seeking to preserve their interests and to preserve their power and their wealth in their own little hamlet or their own little area, their own little bounded territory. Now, these local caudillo bands that formed in this context were very badly equipped. It's not as if they were professional militaries, but they were trained enough and had the guns, but most importantly, their word was the law. In an environment of lawlessness and where there is no rule of law and no central authority, it's he or she who has the guns who makes the word, who makes the law. And it is this struggle to appropriate the means of violence and to use the means of violence that helps to legitimate or at least create the foundation for authority in a place where there is no central authority and there has been no process of sorting and filtering in state consolidation. This is the post-colonial period. This is the early period of state development where there was no state, there was no nation state. Instead, there were caudillos and criollos, military units, guns, and word as law. This is post-colonial Latin America. Post-colonial Latin America during this period, it was a gruesome, horrific existence for those who found themselves unlucky enough to be there at the time. I say that because it was a period of absolute grotesque violence, economic depression, reliance on decentralized militias for security and livelihood. Does this remind you, for example, of Somalia and contemporary Somali warlords? It should, because it was very similar. Everything, any semblance of order, be it politics, economic holdings, law enforcement, authority, all of these semblances of order depended on armed force, not the rule of law. Armed force, as formed by caudillos and bands of caudillos practicing caudillismo in the name of those criollos who enlisted them to defend their property and their interests. Now, in these clashes, someone would prevail. Even if there is an absence of the rule of law and total disorder, eventually someone would prevail in these struggles, right? Well, thus emerged national caudillos. These were essentially strongmen who rose to such a height that they could claim authority over the entirety of the nation or the state. They seized control nationally and they claimed to represent the nation, but they still mainly operated through violence. And again, this had to do with appropriating and really holding the means of violence in the form of the guns. They who had the guns, they who had the word of law. I'm going to check the chat really quickly. This reminds me of the warlord period in China. Totally. I don't know that period, so I can't comment, but I think that you're probably onto something. I think this is a process that plays out in a lot of different places during a period of state development where there's a need to kind of consolidate power some way before you can create central authority. Now, the most famous of the national caudillos was Juan Manuel de Rosas of Argentina, who ruled from 1829 to 1851. He was a wealthy landowner, and he used a secret police force called the Mazorca to murder his opponents. They called him Bloody Rosas, and he was bloody precisely because of the relentless violence that he used to consolidate and build his power. Now, his favorite rallying cry was death to the Unitarians. He said this because he favored a federal form of government which would permit him and his allies, also wealthy landowners, to preserve their own influence in their own area of the country. Now, a unitary state, by contrast, would concentrate power in the capital and would come at the expense of those wealthy landowners in the countryside who would want more autonomy and more influence or more control over their matters. Why did Rosas rule, and why was he so important? Why was he able to establish a monopoly of violence, so to speak, in this very limited way? Well, he was able to do so because he had the largest army camped outside Buenos Aires, and he had alliances with provincial caudillos. These alliances were very, very important because they created a military force that was substantial enough to prevail upon those others and to represent the interests of the wealthy landowners that existed in the countryside in Argentina. De Rosas was an important example of the use of violence to legitimate authority. When there is no rule of law and no set system of laws and norms, again, violence reigns, and they who can monopolize violence in however way they do so, they are the ones who emerge and rise to the top and fill the void, so to speak. De Rosas was one example, but there were many, many others. Orlando says, this reminds me of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and the violent nature of man, the state of nature. It totally does. I agree. This is very consistent with what Hobbes was writing about. Now, post-colonial Latin America. Let's take a look very briefly at some different examples of how these divisions played out and how this disorder manifested. Latin American states were torn between opposing sides. In no case was there national unity. In fact, in Argentina, it was a confederation of interior provinces versus Buenos Aires. Those provinces, largely populated by wealthy landowners who viewed the concentration of power in Buenos Aires as antagonistic to their interests in the countryside. In Uruguay, it was Montevideo, current capital, versus the countryside. Similar in Argentina. In Ecuador, it was Quito in the Sierras Mountains versus Guayaquil on the southwest coast. This is a division that still persists to this day. In Peru, it was north in the south coast versus the Sierra, the central Sierra, the mountains, very similar to Ecuador. In all of these countries, the groups that populated these different areas had opposing interests, fundamentally because of their economic holdings and the nature of their economic relationships. So for example, Buenos Aires was different than the countryside because in the countryside, agriculture reigned, whereas in Buenos Aires, they had more primitive industry and economic activities that were different and created interests that were different than those in the countryside. There were also ideological battles that permeated all of these conflicts. And these battles largely revolved around the tension between liberals and conservatives. These raged throughout the 19th century, both sides hiring mercenaries to kill the other. I'm going to repeat that, both sides hiring mercenaries to kill the other. Question was, who would arbitrate between these sides? Who would restore order? The main idea is that political order would only be secured via military action. Yet again, through the late 1800s, political order is established through military action, not through the consolidation or the legitimation of state power on some other basis, but through military action carried out by caudillos and individuals with the capacity to mobilize military force, but not national military force, their own military force. This is the state of nature in post-colonial Latin America. Now, we're just about done, but I want to pause and I want to put a question to you that we'll take up, but also continue with on Wednesday. And that question is, does the political fragmentation and division in post-colonial Latin America remind you at all of present-day Latin America? And how so? Does this fragmentation and division resemble the same fragmentation and division that still exists today in Ecuador or Peru, Argentina, Uruguay? Do you think that there's been a fundamental change or a shift, or do you think that there's been a continuation of that fragmentation? This is a key question because it bears on how states would fully form in Latin America and the nature of the process of state building and nation state building in Latin America. Now, we're basically out of time, and I don't think that we have the time to do this question justice, but I'm content leaving you with this question so that you can ponder this question and think about this fragmentation and division and whether or not it's a feature of the old Latin America exclusively or if it still characterizes Latin America today. Before we leave, I just want to tell you that I have updated the syllabus and I posted that new syllabus on CAT courses. Now, I think I'm going to go ahead and send an email tomorrow with that new syllabus so that you all have a copy of it. Just a few changes. I did take off a couple units later on in the course that I think we can collapse into some other units, but you'll see that. And there really are no changes in terms of the deadlines or the readings. It's just what we'll be discussing on different days and what readings you'll have to have completed by different days. So this does complete our discussion and lecture for today. I think that we had a very useful discussion. I learned a lot from your individual groups, and I think that we're doing a good job thinking about interests and ideas and institutions and how they either changed or persisted through the post-independence and state development periods. We'll continue and finish the focus on post-colonial development on Wednesday, but you are free to go. I'll hang around and answer any questions that you may have, but I do look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, and have a great evening, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Thank you, everyone. I'm so happy that you're with us tonight. I can't wait to see you again on Wednesday.